Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This time it's a video game collecting memories video. So this may not be for all my comic book fans out there, but it's definitely, it focuses around the Sega Saturn, one of my favorite systems that I've ever played, happy to have in my collection, and it's really just a tribute to the system and some of the games that I have. I have a lot of great memories of the Sega Saturn and some of the games, and I wanted to share some of that with everyone. So, how do we start this? Well, what is the Sega Saturn? How many people have actually heard of it or actually have played it? It's not an obscure video game system by far. It was the successor to the Sega Genesis, one of the most famous video game systems ever released. And naturally, Sega Genesis was beating Nintendo for a very long time. And they did a tremendous job. So naturally, one would think that their successor, the first CD, well, not necessarily the first, excuse me, I take that back. It wasn't the first CD-based Sega system. That was the Sega CD. But the first CD 32-bit system for Sega. Figured that would come out and be a success, right? Not the case. Not the case. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the video. But let's talk a little bit about the Sega Saturn. It was built to be a 2D powerhouse. And at the last minute, when Sega found out that PlayStation was going to be gearing their system for 3D, Sega added another processor to the Saturn, which made programming for the system for third-party support and everyone else a little more difficult. One of the things that may have contributed to why the Sega did not have as much third-party support as the Sony PlayStation. But this was the first model of the United States, the North American Sega Saturn, as you can see, with the oblong buttons. They later released a Model 2 that had circular buttons. In Japan, they had a ton of different Saturns. The Sega Saturn was very popular in Japan. They released a gray Saturn. They released the V Saturn. They also released this one, the second model, the white Saturn, as you can see with the circular buttons. My version here has been modded. It could play. It obviously plays Japanese games, but it also can play North American games and PAL games. So, one of my favorite systems to have in my collection. There are many other systems. There are Saturn collectors out there that have every model, some rarer than others, but nonetheless cool to have. So, like with all videos, I have my notes and all that stuff. So, how did I get into the Sega Saturn? Well, I got into it. I was a Sega fan, but I didn't really know too much about the Saturn until I started hanging out with my friend Chris. He was one of the people that I mentioned in my comic book year 3-ish video. He was into role-playing games. He had a Sega CD. The first game I saw him playing was Lunar 2. So naturally, he wanted to upgrade, so he got the Sega Saturn, thinking that that was going to be, you know, a role-playing game powerhouse. And it really wasn't, but no one knew that at the time. But that's where I first encountered the Sega Saturn. I remember, I was still in high school. Chris was 2 years older than me, and he was working full-time, and every other week or every week it seemed like he was buying a new Sega Saturn game. And I remember watching him play these games, and I became very interested in the Saturn until I eventually got one in 1996. But hanging out with Chris, he introduced me to a whole bunch of games like Clockwork Knight and Shinobi and Johnny Bazooka Tone. I first saw him play this one, Panzer Dragoon Zwei. Great game. On-rail shooter. Astal. You know, like I said, Sega Saturn was built to be a 2D powerhouse with big, beautiful sprites and music and all that other stuff. If you ever wanted to see the true power of the Sega Saturn, what it could really do when it comes to 2D graphics, look no further than Astal. Watch clips of it on YouTube. If you have it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Absolutely stunning and gorgeous. Every frame seemed like a work of art. During the summer of '96, I was introduced, well, a little before the summer of '96, excuse me, I was introduced to this, Guardian Heroes. I remember talking about this guy, Joe, in my comic book collecting video. He was a stereotypical nerdish looking guy. Big thick glasses, button-down shirt, pants that came up to his ankles. He would do Beavis and Butthead voices, which were annoying. They were never funny. So he would go on and on about it, thinking that they were funny. Very stereotypical notion of a geek. And I remember him wanting to play football with some people. And people were like, oh, this guy, he's going to be easy to take on. Joe was very strong and potentially dangerous, coming from a crazy background which he came from. But he introduced me to Guardian Heroes, so I guess he wasn't that bad. During the holiday season of 1996, I got introduced to this game, Mr. Bones, a very difficult game. This game is a conglomerate of different genres. Sometimes it's a 2D platformer, sometimes it's one of those games like Simon where you have to hit certain things at a certain time. Sometimes it's an on-rails sort of gaming experience. It's a whole bunch of, it's a mishmash of different things, which I think led to the game not being so successful, and the fact that it's very difficult. I can't get past the third level, but despite that, it's still a very fun game. It's got some really cheesy FMV, full motion videos in it that are really cool to watch. I know they're on YouTube. You can always check them out there. But what really got me into the Sega Saturn, before any of this, besides Chris and all that, was that I was a big Mortal Kombat fan. And Mortal Kombat 3 was on the Sony PlayStation. That was supposed to be the definitive version of Mortal Kombat 3, arcade perfect, right? Saturn didn't get that. But they got Ultimate Mortal Kombat, which was an amped up version of Mortal Kombat 3 with extra characters. This was the game that sold me on the Sega Saturn. This, and being a comic book fan, X-Men Children of the Atom, the precursor to Marvel vs. Capcom, the precursor to Marvel Superheroes, the precursor to X-Men vs. Street Fighter. X-Men characters doing Street Fighter-like moves. It was a fantastic game, beautiful artwork, and just a fantastic game to play. Very easy to control on the Sega Saturn. It was released eventually on the Sony PlayStation, but the fluidity of it was just not there. It was good, but not as tight. Same thing with Street Fighter the Alpha series 1 and 2. Not as tight on the Sony as it was for the Sega Saturn, because the Sega Saturn was built for that purpose, for 2D graphics and sprites and all that, and they did it very well, better than the Sony, in my opinion. Come 97, though, as much as I enjoyed playing the Saturn and stuff, Chris got a PlayStation, I got a PlayStation. So I sort of drifted away from the Sega Saturn. And I wasn't really into role-playing games at that time. Although the Sega Saturn did not have that many role-playing games, it did have some at the time, and they did release a few, but I would never have wanted to play them in 97 or 98 anyway. So I just drifted away from Sega Saturn in 97 and didn't look back for a while until in 2002, 5 years later. Actually, the Sega Saturn ceased production in 98 in the United States. It was still very popular in Japan and still sold a lot and was doing well, but it wasn't doing well in the United States. It couldn't compete with Sony PlayStation or Nintendo. And Nintendo was getting its butt kicked by Sony PlayStation 2. So, the once big rival of Sega, Nintendo, they were getting their asses handed to them too by Sony. And it was just too much competition. So they decided to focus in on the next system, which would have been the Dreamcast, and gave up on the Saturn, in my opinion, prematurely. But beside that, in 2002, when I was at that time, I was into role-playing games, and I started collecting more role-playing games for the Sony PlayStation. I wanted to see what the Saturn had, what I missed out on, and I started collecting for the Saturn, and I was so surprised to find out how expensive the Saturn games were. They were expensive. You get like an older PlayStation 1 game for like $19.99, $14.99, at the very most $29.99. But the Saturn games, depending on which ones you got, were $50, $60, $100 more. And so I just couldn't believe it. So I took a risk on buying some games, and it turned out that the risk was really, it was worth it because they were good games. But this is back then. I was surprised on how expensive these things were. One of the games I got was by one of my favorite companies of all time. I'll create a video just on them. By Albert Odyssey, released in the United States by Working Designs. Fantastic. Working Designs always gave top-notch translations. They would translate the games from the original Japanese and add humor in them, things that weren't in the original Japanese, and give great packaging, variants. For those of us that are in comic book collecting, the Working Designs was putting variants on disc long before comic books were doing variants. Different disc designs. This is the one I have. I know the other one has a close-up of this character right here. I think his name is Grizz. So it prompted collectors of Working Designs, and Working Designs had one hell of a cult following, to get all the copies because of the variants. It was pretty ingenious, but man, did you get a great packaging. Foil covers, translation notes. They would talk about, Working Designs would talk about the difficulties they ran into in changing some of the things for the American release. They were really good with their fans, and they eventually went out of business in 2002. I'll give you some pricing. I bought this for about $65 back in 2002. It's a complete copy. Today, Albert Odyssey will run you anywhere between $175 and $200. Excuse me. So Saturn games were expensive then, and they're very expensive now. Here's another game I purchased, another role-playing game, first-person role-playing game, dungeon crawler type thing, Shining the Holy Ark. Really, really good game. It's also part of the Shining series that started on the Sega Genesis. The first of which was this one, Shining in the Darkness. And then they went to, I believe, Shining Force, and Shining Force 2, Shining Force 3, and all that. But Shining in the Holy Ark was really good. I think I got that for about $45 back in 2002. Now it'll run you anywhere between, complete copy, and it will run you anywhere between $100 and $125. Another game by Working Designs, one of my favorite strategy games of all time, Dragon Force. Fantastic game. Big 2D sprites on the screen. It's 2D heaven with this. I paid about $80 for this back then. Dragon Force now, a complete copy, will run you maybe about between $150 and $175. And one of the last games I got for the Sega Saturn back in 2002, I mean, I still collect for the Sega Saturn when I can, but back in 2002 when I had that new wave, that renaissance of Sega Saturn collecting, was this one right here. I got this for $39.99. Magic Knight Ray Earth, a wonderful action RPG by none other than Working Designs. Beautiful, beautiful hand-drawn sprites. It's amazing. It's amazing. Even playing it today, it's a fantastic game. Magic Knight Ray Earth today, it is the last Sega Saturn that ever came out in the United States. It was the last that came out in 1998. It will run you today anywhere between $300 to $400. Told you, some of these games could rival some keys in comic book community. The very last game I got in 2002, I thought I needed to have my head examined for spending as much as I spent. I spent $180. I had never spent $180 on a video game before, especially a game like it for Sega Saturn. I'm like, well, I'm sort of getting back into the Saturn, but to spend that much on a Sega Saturn game, it's just crazy. These games that for a system that's no longer out, it's just unreal. But I did it because I read reviews on this game, and I couldn't find it cheaper. I mean, sometimes it would go for maybe $160 or $170, but the one I paid after taxes, after shipping, was about $180, $182. I remember getting it off of eBay. And it's this game right here. Panzer Dragoon Saga. a terrific game. And this is a game that Sega, even though Sega is no longer in the console business, they make games for Nintendo and Sony and Xbox and so forth. This is one series that they should definitely resurrect, because this is when, like with the other Panzer Dragoon games, they were on-rail shooters, which means that your character is constantly running. In this case, it's a dragon, and you have to shoot the obstacles. This one, you get to ride the dragon, but this time it's not an on-rail shooter. They turned it into a role-playing game. It was epic on 4 discs. Today, Panzer Dragoon Saga, a complete copy, would probably run you anywhere between $500 to $700. I've seen them go for a little less. I've seen them mainly go in that range, and sometimes I've seen them go for a little more than $700. It's a rare game, and very sought out, very collectible, and on top of that, it's a good game. So many rare games that come out, or that had come out, sometimes more often than not, they're not really that good. You know, they're just rare. They're just not playable, and you can make that argument for a lot of them that, well, they're just not really that good. Panzer Dragoon Saga is not one of them. It is a very, very good game. I mean, the graphics are a little dated. I mean, the games came out 20 years ago. But a very, very good game. Now, all the prices I mentioned now are as of this March 2018. You could watch this video another year from now, and the prices could be less or they could be more. So keep that in mind. If you're watching this video beyond March 2018, maybe the price has changed. So as I close this video, and I thank you all for sticking with me these 16 minutes, what happened? Why did the Sega Saturn collapse? If Sega Saturn had great games and was the successor to Sega Genesis, one of the most popular and beloved video game systems of all time, why did it fail? We could sit here and talk an hour on why it failed, and I probably don't have all the answers for you, but some of the things that I believe, that I've read, I've heard, that led to the Sega Saturn's failure are as follows. It was dead on arrival because they released it when Sega made the announcement that Sega Saturn is going to be released. They said it's actually released today, and this was in May of 1995. It was originally supposed to come out in September, around the time the Sony PlayStation was coming out. They wanted to get the jump on Sony, so they did. By doing that, they at the I forget what it was, Electronics Expo, or whatever, they announced that it's available right now, and you could go buy it at Toys R Us and these other outlets. This infuriated a lot of people, in particular KB, because they were not ready for the stock, and they, as a result, refused to carry Sega Saturn, and that hurt Saturn. Because I remember at the time I was working at KB Toys, and they had Sony. They didn't have Saturn, so that didn't help. And a lot of the developers were told by Sega to speed up the production of these games so they could be released before September, and a lot of them were angered by this, and a lot of them released product that really wasn't finished, all to get the jump on Sony, and it just did not work. It just did not work. And famously, this is one of the famous things about that day in May of 1995. I forget what day it was. The Sega Saturn was $399. After Sega left the stage and Sony came on the stage, I forget who it was, the representative, he famously went to the microphone, looked at the crowd, and said, $299, telling everybody that the Sony PlayStation was going to be $100 less, to an outstanding round of applause. Some say at that point, Sega was dead. Also, I think what contributed as time went on, there was no true sequel to Sonic the Hedgehog. People, you know, if you're a Nintendo fan, you want to see a Mario game or a Zelda game. Sega fans wanted to see a true blue, in addition to new games, of course. They wanted to see a new Sonic the Hedgehog, a Sonic the Hedgehog 4. They never got it. They got Sonic 3D Blast, and I think they got Sonic Extreme, but those were not Sonic the Hedgehog 4. That hurt it. Sega released Virtua Fighter 3 in the arcades, I think in 1997. I think 96, 97. A spectacular game. Didn't come out for the Saturn. Third-party developers did not want to make games for the Saturn because it was difficult to program for because of that second processor I mentioned earlier in the video. That hurt the Saturn. In 1997, the new head of Sega, Bernie Solar, said, Saturn is dead. We're going to focus on making the next system, which would have been the Dreamcast. Well, why am I going to invest in the Sega Saturn now? I'll just go buy a PlayStation. If the head of Sega is saying the Saturn's dead, that means that they're not going to be making many more games for it. There were a lot of mistakes made about this on the Saturn, and it's a shame because it really could have been more than what it's perceived to be today. Thank you all for watching. I will release more video game videos concentrating on Sony, working designs, all that sort of stuff. I appreciate you traveling back with me and listening to me talk about my memories of the Sega Saturn and why I think it was such a really good system, because it really was a good system. It's a good system to this day and has a lot of games that a lot of people overlook. Thank you for watching.